Hi everybody, thanks so much for joining us. My name is Dominic D'Souza from Elim's National Leadership Team. We'd like to welcome you to this webinar entitled The Coronavirus Vaccine, Informed Perspectives. The approval and rollout of COVID vaccines in the UK has attracted much opinion and clearly a lot of emotion too. It can be difficult at times to know how to navigate all of the information, which we appreciate can be complex and confusing. There have also been questions raised about the ethics and the efficacy of the vaccine. Our hope in putting on this webinar today is to bring some clarity for Elim leaders and Elim members alike. And we've invited some well-respected voices in their field to help us navigate through some of the issues. Our prayer is that when it comes to the question of whether or not we will receive the vaccine, each of us will be in an informed position to come to our own well-considered opinion. And with that in mind, I'd like to hand on to Dave Newton, our host today. He's the Principal of Regent's Theological College and the Director of Training for Elim. Dave, over to you.
Thank you, Dominic, and it's great to be with you this afternoon. We're hoping it's going to be a fantastic time together where we can grow and learn and be informed about this key issue. Well, who would have thought at the start of 2020, just 12 months ago, what impact COVID would have on us all? This pandemic has affected us globally. It's affected us nationally. It's affected us regionally and personally. And all of us have stories of how this has had an impact on us. Right now here in England, we are in the middle of lockdown 3.0. And for many areas around our country, you've been in lockdown for many, many months. Just before Christmas, we received news of the approval of the first vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine. And since Christmas, 2 more vaccines have come online, the Moderna and Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines. In fact, BBC announced yesterday that 2.6 million people in our country have already had the first dose, and the rollout of this vaccine is accelerating quickly. It seems to many that the vaccine is the big solution. It's the light at the end of the tunnel. But for many, there are some big questions, some unanswered questions that we're hoping to address this afternoon to give you informed information so that you can make an informed choice. Where has the vaccine come from? How's it been developed so quickly? What's being used in the development of the vaccine, and what effect will it have on me? How do we ensure that there's equal distribution of vaccines around some of the developing countries around the world? Has the testing process been robust, and can the vaccine be trusted? How do we balance the ethics around the development with the ongoing issues of loss of life? Alongside this, there's been so many interesting theories, misinformation, conspiracies. How do we know who to listen to and who to trust? Well, this afternoon, you are in the right place because you're going to be hearing from a range of experts in their own field. We have medical practitioners, those who are working on the front line and have received the vaccine themselves. Pastors, theologians who are trying to navigate some of the ethical challenges and support others in their decision making. So without further ado, let me explain how the show is going to go forward. We're going to take the first half an hour to have presentations from a number of key people. We're going to look at a medical perspective, a personal perspective, a theological and a pastoral perspective. And then the second half, we'll get to answer your questions. So I want to encourage you right now, as you're listening to some of these presentations, type in your questions into the chat, whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, and we'll be able to gather those questions and answer as many as we can towards the end of our time together. Well, to start and get our medical perspective, I am so pleased to introduce you to 2 of our incredible guests. The first person is Debbie Duncan. Debbie is a lecturer in nursing at Queen's University, Belfast. She's also an advanced practitioner a respiratory specialist nurse. She's an author, church leader, and a mother to go alongside that as well. And we're so pleased to have you with us, Debbie. And alongside Debbie, we're going to have Chris Shaw. Chris is an emeritus professor at the Queen's University Belfast, and he's a church elder. And Chris was formerly held a professorship in drug discovery and pharmacy at Queen's University. And there's some long names here, Chris. Biotechnology in the University of Ulster, and Peptide Biochemistry as well to boot. So I'm going to hand over to these two experts who are going to give us a medical perspective on all things to do with the vaccine.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. I am going to start. My name is Debbie, and then Chris is going to follow. We just have a few slides that we also want to share with you to help with this topic. And first of all, we want to talk a little bit about the history of vaccines and how they're produced. So the first thing I want to talk about is just a really brief history, really. A lot of us are aware of that. And so we're just going to move on to the next slide. So we know that there's been vaccines since 1798 with the production of the smallpox vaccine. That's a long time. To be fair, it took nearly 2 centuries for that to work. But in 1980, the World Health Organization eradicated smallpox. Fantastic in that has made a huge difference to life. And what we do know is that the impact of vaccines on the world health has made a considerable difference to people's mortality, morbidity, population growth. And if you look at the bottom quote on this slide, it says that it's estimated that vaccines have prevented 6 million deaths from vaccine-presentable disease. And that was annually. That was 2003. So you can obviously understand the impact now that it is having. And there are various blessings from having vaccines. So we'll go on to the next slide. Some of the graphics on this aren't so clear. But what I want to do is just share with you that, you know, they do make a huge difference. And I know that these will be covered later on, from impacting our economy to improving health and well-being and socially improving the situation for a majority of people. And what we also know is that that scientists themselves involved in these processes are doing this from themselves as often a strong ethical background, a strong ethical basis. They themselves want to make a difference to the health of our nation, and that's why they've been produced. So we'll go to the next slide. Vaccines work in a variety of different ways. They protect us against all sorts of bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi. The key part of it is the pathogen, or the antigen, which is a unique subpart of that bacteria or virus. And when it's presented to our immune system, the majority of us will go through a process where our immune system is stimulated and we produce antibodies to help us fight an infection. Each antibody in our immune system is trained to recognize specific antigens, parts of those different pathogens. And what we also know is that antigen-specific antibodies work in collaboration with the rest of our immune system. We have something called an immune cascade where everything goes into work to help us fight what we are in contact with. The other thing that we do know is that generally we are in contact with thousands of pathogens each day, but obviously there are some that we have to take very seriously, and obviously COVID-19 is one of those. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is a picture from the World Health Organization. They've got some really helpful resources, and they talk about how vaccines work on their website. It's worth having a look at it. And you can see from these graphics that with each individual pathogen, new antibodies are produced. We already have also some existing ones to things that we've been in contact with in the past as well. And we'll move to the next slide. Vaccines generally contain, as I said before, an activated part of an antigen, sometimes a very small part of that pathogen, but there are different ways that vaccines are produced, and Chris is going to spend a bit more time talking about that in a minute. When the body detects the contents of the vaccine, then the immune system is primed and ready to make antibodies so that in future, when you are exposed to it, then you can fight it. It doesn't cause the disease, but you can get minor symptoms because the immune system has been flared up, and it's part of that process. And what we also know is that vaccine efficiency is also dependent on the type of vaccine that's being produced, and often it has to be given again. And you'll know that from the vaccines that you've probably had. So move to the next slide. The other very important thing to consider when we think about immunity and vaccines is that not everyone can be vaccinated. Some people have immunological disorders, which means that they have a weakened immune system. And these are the people that we want to think about when we're thinking about vaccinations, because if we can actually increase the number of people that are vaccinated, then these people hopefully will be protected from catching the disease themselves and will be less likely to be in contact with that pathogen. This is known as herd immunity, and you would have heard this at the beginning of the pandemic. It was certainly something that people were talking about. So we'll move to the next slide. What we know is that vaccines usually are either weakened or chemically modified or killed cells themselves, and they are utilized to help us to produce these antibodies. As I said before, Chris is going to speak a little bit about these now, but the main ones that we know about are the Pfizer, Moderna ones. They use this novel approach for targeting COVID, and obviously, there is the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine as well. They all work in different ways. There's pluses and benefits for all of them. But again, they do make a difference. So thank you, Chris. I will leave this to you now.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm just going to take up on a point that Debbie just alluded to there, and that is how vaccines against viruses are normally produced. And normally they use the virus itself that has either been killed, it's had its DNA or RNA removed, or it has been chemically modified, or it has been weakened in some way. So the vaccine consists of the entire virus, which our immune system recognizes and makes antibodies to. And it will make antibodies to lots of different parts of the surface of that particular virus. And that is the conventional approach. The problem with the conventional approach with COVID is that conventional approach takes a very long time. And that long time, unfortunately, we didn't have that luxury in terms of producing a COVID vaccine. And that is the major reason why these companies, the Pfizer, the Moderna approach, and the Oxford AstraZeneca approach, used, let's say, experimental approaches to making vaccines. And in this particular area of expertise and approach, they don't use the virus itself. In fact, there was no virus at all present in these vaccines. Instead, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines use a piece of what is called messenger RNA. And this is a piece of genetic information that actually encodes the proteins that are the antigens on the surface of the vaccine. And a small piece of that is what is actually used to inject and produce the vaccine. That is why those vaccines have to be stored at -70 degrees centigrade, because messenger RNA is a very unstable molecule. In contrast, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine uses a technique which uses a virus itself, albeit a virus that does not cause human disease. And the part of the COVID protein, its DNA is attached to the DNA of that virus. So the virus makes the protein. It is produced on the surface of the cells, of your cells, and your body is fooled into thinking you have a virus infection. So these approaches are all quite unusual approaches. They are modern approaches. The mRNA approach hitherto has been an experimental approach. But what it has shown us is that these vaccines can be made in a very short period of time. So the disadvantage that they may have in being to a very small part of the virus is, I think, outweighed by the fact that you can produce these rapidly, such that if the virus does mutate and the vaccine doesn't happen to cover that particular mutant virus, it's relatively quick to make another vaccine that will serve that particular purpose. So that's the rationale behind the new science in producing these vaccines. And many scientists were actually very surprised at just how efficient this method or these methods of virus production actually have been, such that now all 3 vaccines have now been licensed for use within the UK and are becoming available. And I think, as was mentioned at the start of the presentation, over 2.6 million people have now received these vaccines. The thing about vaccination is that vaccination has been regarded in the press, as you know, over the past few weeks, as being a great positive thing in our society. And certainly with respect to producing this herd immunity, the more people that receive the vaccine, the fewer people the virus is going to be able to infect, and hence pass on that particular infection in the population. So this is, I think, one of the reasons why government, but also healthcare professionals, are virtually universally in favor of people receiving that vaccine. There may be some questions about the efficacy of the vaccine, and I think most of those have now been answered. They're very efficacious. They work very well. Secondary questions about the safety of these vaccines. And vaccines, like virtually every other vaccine and every other drug, the current vaccines are very safe, have been very well tested through the normal routes, albeit accelerated routes, but through proper clinical testing. All have been shown to be efficacious with very, very low side effects. Remembering, of course, that any vaccine or any drug does in fact have side effects.
Thank you. That's from both of us.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you so much, Chris, for sharing that. We're going to come back to you later on with some questions to drill further into some of the medical side of things and understand that a little bit more. But it's like my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Kofi Abubi, and he is a medical doctor in the Cardiff, South Wales area. Kofi, it's great to have you with us. You are a consultant physician, and you are going to share with us a little bit of a personal story, because you were probably one of the early people to have the first part of the vaccine. So please tell us how it's been for you over the last kind of 9 months, dealing in the NHS setting, dealing in the hospital around some of these issues of COVID.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. I think there's no doubt that we are not in normal times has been extremely challenging in terms of basically this pandemic and what it has done to our population. And for us who work in hospitals, it's been humbling actually to see the number of sick people who have had to come into hospital and the various presentations that they've come with. It's been a challenge for medical team and hospital teams in particular. And in my role to supervise junior doctors and also to work alongside other healthcare professionals, nurses, and then also physiotherapists and other, it's been a real challenge. Well, the good news for us is that, I mean, obviously we now have better resources now to look after our patients, and then also the very good news of the fact that we do have the vaccine now in place.
Fabulous. So you had the vaccine, Kofi. Was it before Christmas or just after Christmas?
So I've had my first injection or first vaccination. That was before Christmas. And obviously it's the vaccine. It was the Pfizer vaccine that I had. It's initially rolled out to the vulnerable population, so elderly above 80, and then also those in care homes, and then also key workers like myself.
Yeah.
And so I mean, obviously, I was called. I took my 10. I was called just before Christmas, and I went for the vaccination. Initially, obviously, I had the same sensitivity. I've had the same worries and concerns, and what ifs. But obviously, I mean, knowledge. I mean, because I have the knowledge, but then at the same time, we also have the wisdom of God, and also, basically, the truth. And the truth has guided me to do this.
Yeah. So did you have any particular apprehensions? And what would you say to somebody who knocked on your door or spoke to you and says, I'm a little bit worried about having this vaccine? What would your advice to them be as a neighbour, but also as a medical practitioner?
I think obviously I would say that it is entirely understandable that they do have apprehensions and some concerns about that because not having the information. But firstly, what I would also say that there is no doubt that we are dealing with a condition that is a a pandemic that is very serious, and obviously he or she would be aware of what is done to our community, our nations, done to our world, is done to our families, our loved ones, and our environment. And that, up till now, there had been no opportunity or any chance that this was going to remit. I will say to them that, I mean, obviously, they need to know, where to find the right information, and the right information is available through reliable sources. For example, government websites, and then also, more importantly as well, from the World Health Organization. I will say to them that I have had the vaccine, and I didn't have the vaccine because I looked at the evidence that was available, and the evidence for me was robust. It had gone through a rigorous testing in terms of initial safety studies, and then after that, good trials. I mean, and obviously done some of the research work myself. I could clearly see that, I mean, I had gone through very, very clinical trials for efficacy. Granted, we only know what you will do, I mean, what these vaccines will do in a in the time period of the trial, and perhaps we don't know what will happen for in the year or so to come. It's also important that obviously the vaccine, as was mentioned before, is recognized not for everybody. There are some who can generate a full immune response, so it's important that they check with the the government websites and the information to know whether they fit the criteria or not. And then finally, after that, to wait their turn. In terms of side effects, I would say that the only thing that I had was a little bit of an ache on the arm, like, a boxer had given you a gentle tap the next minute. But otherwise, I was absolutely fine.
Kofi, thank you so much for sharing your story and being willing to answer some questions that some of our viewers will be asking at the end of our time together. We really appreciate you sharing with us this afternoon. Thank you so much. We wanted to make sure, as part of this presentation, we didn't just look at the medical side, but we took a moment just to reflect theologically about some of the key themes and different issues surrounding this particular issue of the vaccine. So we've invited the Reverend Dr. Simo Frestadius. He is Dean of Research at Regent's Theological College. He's an expert in Pentecostal theology, and he's been doing a little bit of reading into this subject. So Simo, share some thoughts. Give us 5-minute reflections on some of your theological themes around this particular vaccine.
Thank you, Dave, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, I suppose reflecting from a theological perspective on whether someone should take the vaccine or not, for me, this is really a question of theological and spiritual discernment. And as a question of spiritual discernment, it is first worth highlighting the importance of the Christian community, as well as the wider communities that we find ourselves in. Community matters because spiritual discernment in scriptures is always a communal affair. It is done together, not in isolation. And we need to discern together because it is with others that we are often able to transcend our own biases and ignorance. For example, I'm delighted to have heard Chris and Debbie and Kofi and just learn from their insights even this afternoon. So community really matters in that way. We also need to discern together because although in the end, each of us will need to make our own decision, my decision does not just impact me, but it can have significant implications for those around me. So again, community matters here. If discernment then should be done in a communal context, which I think it should be, what general principles might help us then in the process? As we're looking at this question in an Elim and a Pentecostal environment, I would like to make 3 brief observations from Pentecostal history and Elim's history as a movement when it comes to testing the spirits, so to speak. First, our decisions as Pentecostal people have been and should be biblically grounded. Now, of course, the Bible does not talk about vaccines because they were not around at the time. That said, the wider biblical narrative and key biblical principles should guide our thinking on this matter. Second, our decisions as Elim folk should be doctrinally sound, not least in light of our foundational truths. In other words, our core beliefs about God, about the world, about humanity, about sin, about salvation, about mission should inform how we live in the world and how we make major decisions. Third, the value of our decisions is to a large extent known by their fruits. Now, I'm not advocating here a purist utilitarian ethic, but I'm emphasizing the teachings of Jesus when Jesus says, "You will know them by their fruits." So, do my decisions lead to potential kingdom fruit? Does it result in life or does it result in death? In light of this communal context and the proposed three guiding principle of Scripture, core Christian beliefs, and fruit, when I think about the vaccine, I'm reminded of the greatest commandment articulated by Jesus: to love God with everything we have and everything we are, and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So, what is the fruit of my decision in relation to loving my neighbor as I love myself? Some Christians have been concerned about the cell lines from fetal cells used in the development of some of the vaccines. However, as far as I understand, the vaccines do not contain any fetal cells, even if some cell lines derived from them were used in the development of the vaccines. And again, if you want to ask more about this, I'm sure Chris and Debbie and Kofi will be able to shed some more light on that. But I suppose all I'm trying to say here is that from my perspective, taking the vaccine does not violate the love commandment towards the unborn children or undermine my doctrinal views about the sanctity of human life. The positive fruit of taking the vaccine, which we've already heard about, is that I'll potentially protect the vulnerable because taking the vaccine helps to stop the disease spreading. Therefore, it could be argued, and it can be argued, that to take the vaccine is to love my neighbors as it potentially helps to protect them from the virus. What about myself then? After all, the love commandment tells me to love others as I love myself. And some Christians are concerned about the safety of the vaccine, but as again we've heard, it seems to be relatively safe. And for me, the personal fruit of its efficacy against the virus outweighs any potential harmful side effects. Therefore, in taking the vaccine, I could also be seen as loving myself. In summary, as we reflect on the question of the vaccine, I think it is, from a theological perspective, a matter of spiritual, of theological discernment. And I think this we should do in the context of community. And we should be guided by theological principles. And I've just noted Scripture, core beliefs, and the fruit of our actions and our decisions. And fundamentally, I think, as in so much of Christian ethic, we should love our neighbor as we love ourselves. Thank you.
Timo, that was absolutely fantastic and amazing to cover so much in such a short space of time. Really, really appreciate your input on that. And I know you'll come in later on in our question time. Can I encourage you, if you haven't done already, to think about and reflect on what some of our speakers have shared and ask your questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can in the second part of our time together. But our final speaker is the Reverend Malcolm Duncan. I know Malcolm is well known to many of us. He's a pastor, author, speaker, broadcaster, public theologian. He is a theologian in residence for the Essential Christian Working Group and plays a key role for Elim as public and pastoral theology chair of our theological working group. So it's great to have you with us, Malcolm, and I've invited you just to share a pastoral perspective. How do you help us as pastors navigate this with those that we get to pastor? Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you to Kofi, to Chris, to Debbie, and to Simo for what they have brought as well. I should say, as I just begin, a few reflections that Debbie is my wife, and she and I both have COVID and have been battling it now for 3 or 4 weeks, hence the red face as a result of carbon dioxide being inhaled more because we're trying to talk more than we have normally been. I guess what I want to do is build on the medical and the theological and the practical experience of what you've already heard, and ask some questions about pastoral considerations. There's going to be a slide that will appear on the screen that will list these so that you can write them down if you want to. And you can think about what some of these questions might mean for you. First of all, let me talk just for a few moments about the principles of our decision making. I think we really have to work out, as pastors seeking to help and support others, and you that are watching, and I've read some of your questions, what are the principles that you're going to make your choices by? Simo's already talked about community, about scripture, and about the witness of the Spirit. Are we going to, for example, approach this pragmatically? We will take something simply because it works. Are we going to approach it circumstantially, simply because of our immediate context? Or are we going to approach this and help people make decisions that are value driven? In other words, they have a deep sense of right and wrong. I would suggest that a Christian witness goes with the latter, that we have a sense of what's right and what's wrong, and we want to make our decisions pastorally and in supporting people to make decisions based on that reality, that there is such a thing as right and there is such a thing as wrong. We may not always know how clearly they can be defined, but it's important to name it. That means that we're not situationalists. We don't think that every situation demands a different response and it doesn't matter what the response is. We're not consequentialists. In other words, we're not Machiavellian. The end doesn't always justify the means. We want to make choices that are rooted in our core values, and we want to make choices that are rooted in our core convictions. And there is such a thing as right and wrong. Secondly, I think it's important, and even reading some of the comments now, it's important to acknowledge that there is hesitancy amongst many people. I have been hesitant myself about whether or not I should receive a vaccine. Many of you will have been. And there are different reasons for that. But I would suggest that some of them are rooted in the following things. Number one, ethics. There's a dignity of life issue here. There's an abortion issue. There's a question around whether or not the tissue or the material involved in making these vaccines is the cells of dead children or is human remains. I know a number of you have asked a question about that or asked questions about it. So let me try and help you understand that a little bit. There is something called immortal cell lines that have been used in the 3 vaccines that we're talking about. Most of them use something called the HEK293 cell line, which comes from an aborted child in 1973 in the Netherlands and was extracted from kidney material. However, there are no fetal cells used, and there's no fetal matter used in any of the vaccines that we're talking about. There aren't the remains of dead children in the vaccines. There are no chips in the vaccines. There are no electronics in the vaccines. There is no way in which a vaccine can make you lose your salvation. There's no mark of the beast in the vaccine. There's no material that is being inserted into this vaccine that can cause you to lose your salvation. And those of you that are suggesting that that is the case, really, you need to investigate the vaccines. You need to investigate your sources, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But in terms of human matter, it is true that immortal cell lines have been used in either the testing or the production of vaccines. That matters for those that are deeply concerned about issues of life. It matters for me. But what I can say categorically is that there is no evidence whatsoever that human matter itself, that you are contributing to abortions, that you are contributing to the death of children, or that you are somehow approving of abortion if you decided that you should take the vaccine. Human cell lines, immortal cell lines, are clinically reproduced since, in this case, the HEK273 cell line has been clinically reproduced artificially since 1973. So you're not causing that abortion. You're not agreeing with that abortion. And you are not saying that that abortion was good because the resultant impact has been that thousands of vaccines and thousands of treatments have been helped. I'm not suggesting that for a moment. It is possible, like me and all of our panelists, I think, to have a completely pro-life stance and not to be conflicted about whether or not one should receive a vaccine. The vaccines that we are talking about now, the abortions that took place, or the abortion in 1973, did not take place in order to provide this matter so that these treatments could be developed. It's important to recognize that there's a separation between those two things. And it's very important to understand that the facts of the vaccine production are deeply important. Secondly, there is a question around justice in our ethics as we approach this, not just in the question of the dignity of life, but justice for the poor, justice for those countries where vaccines need to be made available. For example, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine aims to be available worldwide at the lowest cost possible. It's not set out to make money. There's a question, you can keep the slide back up if you want to. There's a question around being part of a global family and what that might mean for us and how we can work as the church around the world for persecuted brothers and sisters and those that need help and support in receiving vaccines too. And then there's a question of economics. Do these vaccines simply exist to make money? Or is the global medical community and scientific community setting out to help solve this issue? I would suggest the latter. And lastly, consistency. We must be careful that the treatments that we receive for heart conditions, for high blood pressure, for many other things that have got nothing to do with COVID-19, the reality is that many of these have been tested and tried in ways that we would sit uncomfortably with, but that doesn't mean that they themselves are wrong. Secondly, there's a hesitancy around safety. Is this vaccine safe? Has it been trialed properly? It might help you to know that every year a flu vaccine is produced in about 9 months. And there is absolutely no evidence thus far that this vaccine has significant adverse effects on infertility, although those questions are continuing to be explored. And there is definitely no evidence that it changes the DNA of the person receiving it, because it works on what's called messenger DNA. It doesn't change our DNA, it changes our immune response to the virus or the infection that we might have. And thirdly, there is a question around choice and coercion for us to consider. Will we be forced to have this? Some people are worried that there'll be a vaccine passport. In one sense, there already is, isn't there? You can't go to China, you can't go to Indonesia, you can't go to certain parts of Africa or other countries in the world unless you've received yellow fever vaccines. We don't let people into this country unless they've received rabies vaccines. So there is a question to be considered here that needs further reflection, but it's not a new question. It's a question that we need to think about. Now, just a few more things and then I'm done. In terms of pastorally helping people, I'm seeing a lot of conspiracy theories. I'm seeing a lot of wild ideas that are appearing on the screen and lots of people asking really important questions. Thank you so much. Can I encourage you to check your details, to check your sources, and to make sure that you're not simply reposting something that you've heard somebody else say. What's the source of what you're listening to? What's the content of what you're listening to? How does it sit within a broader Christian narrative? The eschatology of a mark of the beast being contained in the next vaccine, does that really sit with what the New Testament says about eschatology? I don't think so. And I think we need to be careful that we source, that we date, that we evidence, and that we acknowledge that not all that we are reading is true on the internet, and that we take a careful look at ourselves and make sure that we're not bringing our own biases to this issue. And fourthly, I think that you need to work out what your way of making choices is. I'm not a situationalist. I want to make choices based on scripture, on the witness of the Spirit, and on what Simo said, what is best for the broadest number of people within the Christian ethic of loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. What do you do with what you know? You know, you can't unknow the reality that the ways in which these vaccines have been developed, we know some of them. We're uncomfortable with some of them. But that doesn't mean that our close proximity to that knowledge means that we are contributing to abortion. I think instead we need to stop and ask ourselves, what would Christ do in this situation? What are the imperatives? And Simo's already covered it. Loving our neighbor as we love ourselves, seeking to live within the confines of Scripture, and seeking to be faithful to what God has called us to do. Some have said, but this doesn't stop you getting the virus, therefore how is it going to help? Well, it reduces pressure on the NHS, it reduces pressure on beds that are already required, it increases herd immunity, and it helps us to take a corporate responsibility for the welfare of our neighbours and those who are most vulnerable in our communities. Seventhly, what about how close we are to this? Are we continuing in evil by engaging in taking the vaccine? Well, I can't answer that question for you, but I can say that Jesus had dinner with Zacchaeus and ate food that Zacchaeus had bought from money that had been made from false intentions. That doesn't mean that Jesus was sinning. I can say that the New Testament teaches us that we have a decision to make about eating meat that has been offered to idols, about the way in which we live. I think proximity is important and making moral choices is important, but making sure that we're making them without coercion from others that are telling us what we can or we cannot do. I don't think Elim can tell you whether to take this vaccine or not. I certainly wouldn't. but I will take it if it's made available to me, or one that is ethically sourced. That takes me to my 8th point. I really want alternatives that are better, alternatives that don't use human cell lines, alternatives that don't exploit. But until they are available, I have to make a decision based on a complex series of challenges. And one of those is what will help people and sit within a Christian ethic. 2 last things. Can God bring good from evil? Yes. Does that mean that the evil is justified? No. I think, however, we need to recognize that God is with us and that he is for us, and that he wants us to be a good witness for him. And lastly, there's an issue of conscience here, what the New Testament describes as an issue of the adiaphora. There are secondary matters and primary matters. I can't tell you to take a vaccine, nor can I tell you not to take a vaccine. But I can plead with you that you research properly, you pray considerably, you think thoughtfully, you reflect on what's going to be good for wider society and for us. And here's the last thing as I hand back to Dave. There's a response that we can make in the midst of all of this. We're thankful for vaccines and we're thankful for treatments. But in the end, our hope is in Christ. And we want to be a people that position ourselves about the kingdom and about God's purposes and plans. And even in the midst of the uncertainties that we're facing, we proclaim a kingdom that will not end, a God who is close, and a hope that can hold us through everything. Thanks, Dave.
Malcolm, thank you for that whistle-stop tour through some of the pastoral issues, and that's been really helpful. We called this session Informed Perspectives, and we've certainly been informed this afternoon by some brilliant presentations. Debbie, Chris, Kofi, Simo, Malcolm, thank you for what you've been able to bring. As you've been speaking, there's been questions that have been sent into us. So what I'm going to do is invite all of our speakers back onto the screen. And we're going to take a moment just to kind of revisit some of those topics that have probably been dealt with quite quickly. So first of all, Chris, I'm going to come to you, and I want you to just explore a little bit further with us the whole issue of the cell lines and helping us understand that particular aspect. Malcolm's covered it really well there, but just from a medical perspective, and are these cell lines just used in this vaccine, or are they widespread in many of the daily things that we use in life?
Well, for many years, the pharmaceutical industry, when they have been producing drugs and vaccines, have obviously, as part of the production process, they have to test if the molecules they have made, if the vaccines they have produced are toxic. And in many of the early studies, they used animal models, or indeed animal cells. The problem with that is that animal cells are not good models for producing human drugs or evaluating human vaccines. Hence, the availability of human cell lines. Early cell lines were actually derived from tumors, from cancers, but these were found to be very unstable. So there was very little in the way of
Looks like we might have lost you, Chris, somewhere in the process. I don't know if somebody else wants to pick up on that. Debbie, do you want to add to that, or should we move on to another question at this point?
No, just to add to that yes, from 1973, they have used tissue from humans. Again, it's not the original tissue. Again, as Malcolm said, it wasn't decided that they were going to abort a fetus to use this material. This was something that they decided to use. And since then, they have used lots of human types of tissue and all sorts of medication and in vaccines, but they do not contain fetal matter. It's part of the process that was developed at that time. And at that time, it seemed to be the right decision to make. As Chris has said, originally they used material from animals and from tumors. So it's confusing, a lot of conspiracy theories out there, but that's where the original lines came from. I think Malcolm can probably add to it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you, Debbie. I'm gonna pick up slightly more pastorally on that, Malcolm, then. So if someone comes to you in your congregation and says, I personally feel uncomfortable with having this vaccine, which has been developed at the cost of an innocent life. How are you addressing that? I know you've already spoken into that, but let's just nail that one specifically.
I would accept that they don't want to take it. And they may have a number of reasons for that. They may be waiting for an ethical vaccine, Dave. They may be waiting for a different form. They may have convictions that disagree with me about it. But I certainly don't believe that I could coerce or force anybody to take it. The opposite is also true. And I think that is equally important. When somebody says to me, you must tell people not to take it, I believe that they are wrong. What the challenge is, pastorally, you often find that both sides want to tell each other what to do and just spend more time arguing than listening. So, for example, the Roman Catholic Church has said that they believe that there is no moral ambiguity in taking the vaccine. And there are others that have said that there is moral ambiguity in taking the vaccine. Without getting into denominational arguments, I think this is what Martin Luther would have described as an adiaphora, a secondary issue. My job isn't to tell people what to do, and it's not to tell people what to think. My job as a pastor is to help people to think biblically and to make those decisions for themselves. If somebody says, Pastor Malcolm, I don't want to take the vaccine, I want to say back to them, make sure you're looking after those that are vulnerable. Make sure you're protecting people around you. Make sure you're not putting other people at risk. And don't make that decision based on false information or weird conspiracy theories flying around the world.
Yeah. I'm going to come to our resident theologian, Simo. I'm going to bring you in. Lots of people asking questions about end-time prophecies, eschatology. Malcolm alluded to it before, mark of the beast. Is there any way that this vaccine is any way related to, you know, a mark of the beast, something that needs to be avoided in that regard?
Yeah, thank you, Deb. Yeah, I appreciate it. It's a real issue for a lot of people. And I think to give a bit of historical background to that, particularly in the Pentecostal tradition, there have often been people who've viewed different things, whether it's been something to do with computers or mobile phones or other forms of vaccination as kind of marks of the beast. So therefore, this is not a new issue. What I can say that as far as I know, there's no evidence that this is that, as far as I'm aware of. And secondly, I would just caution people on two fronts there. One, I think the whole concept of what we mean by the mark of the beast, how we understand that, that is very tricky to make sense of. And I think I would just caution people before they draw strong conclusions what exactly it may be. And secondly, from a historical perspective, we've often, as Christians, said that this is the mark of the beast. And then after a few years, we said, well, actually, it wasn't. So I would say we've so often got it wrong historically that I think we should have a bit of what I would call epistemological humility in that we don't too strongly make these claims because I think it's unhelpful. And from my perspective, I see no reason why this would be the mark of the beast.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Simo, for that. Kofi, just to kind of come in for a second, you know, you're a medical doctor. You've been working at the chalk face in terms of some of these issues, but you're also a Pentecostal part of the church in Cardiff. If someone came to you as a doctor and says, I'm just going to trust Jesus to heal me on this one, I don't need medical help and medical intervention, what would be your advice to them?
I think in relation to that, if what I will say to them is that, I mean, obviously, we have been praying about this. I'll tell them about my experience about looking after very, very sick persons on the hospital ward. And what we have seen, our population has really been ravaged by this virus. And many families that we know, that I know personally, have been ripped apart by this, and very, very close friends. And so as a church community and personally, we have been praying incessantly and saying to our Lord, would you kindly stop this? Will there be an end to this? That has been part and parcel of our prayers. So we've been praying also for the solution. So for me, the vaccine, the treatments and the vaccine have all been part of this. And if the Bible says to us, I mean, yes, that if the Lord says, if we call upon His name and pray fervently, He will heal the land. I will share my experience with them, and I will say to them that many of us who have taken this have come out okay. But obviously, it's a judgment call for them to make, but to reassure them that for those of us who have gone through and come out of this have been okay. There are those who can't have the vaccine, and we have to be honest about that. There are those who do not generate a full immune response, and everyone has to check whether they fall into that category. They are usually people who have conditions that mean that they take drugs, that mean that their body is immunosuppressed, or they have certain conditions that do that, and they can't have the vaccine. And so they have to check with that. But these are few and far between. And they are the ones that those of us who can have it need to think carefully about it and make that decision so that we can protect them. But ultimately, we need truth, and the truth has to come from the right sources. And I'll say government websites and the World Health Organization holds very, very good information. So please look at the WHO website, which will help you if you don't trust your own government.
Debbie, you make a great point there in the chat that even Jesus had a medic on his team. You know, we need to kind of keep that one in mind. Debbie, let me stay with you though, because we know we're reminded on a daily basis that COVID is a killer, and yet, in a sense, I think most people are understanding that an aspect of COVID is being injected into us as part of this vaccine. Well, why would we have this kind of killer, lethal kind of virus injected into us? Is it not going to cause us some harm?
I think sometimes we get confused about what the vaccine's actually doing, and we are actually trying to elicit a response, an immune response to the vaccine, but it's been inactivated. It's not going to give us COVID. You might have COVID-like symptoms or a mild form of the disease, but we have to take that into consideration with the risk of actually having COVID. And it is significant. It's not a mild cold. It's not like a dose of a flu. And it affects across ages, generations, and people with all sorts of conditions. Anybody's vulnerable to it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Malcolm, can I come to you about this whole narrative that's been in our, I suppose, news from day one? You know, the Prime Minister, Chris Whitty, others have been using this phrase, trust the science, almost like science is the savior. Science has got all of the answers, because whilst we are putting trust in medical physicians and doctors and some of these solutions, is science the answer to all of these things? Where else can we place our hope in these times?
Absolutely not. I think that there's a difference between assuming that science is God and science is evil, however. And one of the challenges is that much of the kind of the conspiracy argument ends up saying you never trust a scientist. Well, I've known many scientists over the years, including Chris, and these are men and women who want the best for people. Every doctor takes the Hippocratic Oath, promising to do no harm. Now, there's a huge ethical discussion around that. But in the end, Dave, and I think that this is an important point, I don't think the church has done such a good job actually at saying act sensibly and maturely, take medical advice, follow the instructions of your doctor, think carefully about this. But in the end, our hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I don't understand the false dichotomy between taking medication, listening to scientists, and trusting in God. And I think it's a dangerous dichotomy to create, because you're trying to suggest that it's one or the other. God has gifted us science. God has gifted us medicine. He's gifted us knowledge. But at the same time, our fundamental hope and my conviction as both a pastor and a theologian is that all healing comes from God, whether that comes through medication, through treatment, or through miraculous intervention. It is God and God alone who brings healing, hope, and strength to a human heart. No one else.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Malcolm. Chris, I'm going to come to you with another question on transmission. I think the answer is we don't quite yet know, but do we have any inkling as to what the vaccination is going to do about the transmission of COVID in the medium term or long term?
I think once people receive the second dose of the vaccine, within maybe 7 to 10 days, they will be hyperimmune and they will not transmit the virus, which is one of the reasons why I am a bit mystified as to the logic behind the delay in giving the second dose of the Pfizer vaccine. I know the clinical data for the AstraZeneca vaccine would suggest it's equally efficacious. after 12 weeks. Such data is not available for the Pfizer vaccine. So I think the simple answer to that is yes, I think you will stop spreading virus should you be infected by that after you've had the second dose.
Fabulous. That's really, really helpful. Let me just pick up on one other issue that I think Malcolm alluded to a little bit earlier. But this whole idea of almost vaccine passport, you know, that my employer is going to force me to do something, or I'm not going to be able to travel anywhere in the world unless I've had this vaccine. I'm going to leave it open. Someone can stick their hand in the air to answer this one. What do we think about some of the kind of the factors that might be forcing us to have the vaccine kind of secondhand, you know, rather than having it, you know, because of our choice or because of our personal morals?
I would think that, Dave, that it's an important question, but it's not a straightforward question. It's important because if you're a social libertarian, like many of us would be, and a Democrat, and you want people to have freedom of choice and movement and things, then this is an important discussion. However, I think it's a little more complicated because we already have restrictions in place for travel, as I already mentioned. The difference is the restrictions for travel that we have in place around vaccines themselves now are at our international borders, not at our internal borders. And I think that there's an important dialogue around freedom of speech. A couple of people have said in questions, for example, I should be free to make whatever choice I want and everybody should accept it. I'm not saying that. I think if your choices are based on good evidence and they're based on the common good, then that's important. But if your choices are based on bad evidence or on theories that are not justified, then there's a bigger issue. And there is an issue around freedom of movement. There's an issue around freedom of conscience. And there's an issue around freedom of consequence. So my position would be, if we are required to have this vaccine by law and we decide not to, no one can force us to, but we will have to be willing to live with the consequences of our choices, just as Christians have for thousands of years. We stand for the truth, we stand for our freedom, and if we are legislated against, no one can take our conscience away and no one can tell us what to do. What I'm not willing to accept is that you can use bad evidence and compare it to good evidence in either direction. There's some bad evidence around science and there's some bad evidence around conspiracy. We need to be mature and be like the people of Issachar to understand the times and really position ourselves with an open Bible, an open spirit, and an open mind. Somebody said in the chat, for example, it's simple, don't take the vaccine. What's the point in having the conversation then? If you've already made a decision, then you're not coming to this with a sense of humility and a posture of listening to what God might say. And I think that's what we should be saying to everybody involved or under our care.
Brilliant. Malcolm, thank you. And for the rest of our panel, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing from that medical perspective. Thank you for your personal perspective, Kofi. Thank you, theological and pastorally. It's important that we get a good grasp of this particular issue because it is important and it is vital, not only for ourselves, but as we lead others and take responsibility as kind of pastors and theologians in the space that we get to operate. Just as I summarize, let me say one or two quick things. First of all, I think this whole idea of going to good sources and getting good evidence is absolutely key. And I just want to emphasize our responsibility as pastors and leaders to check sources before we share things on to inform others. We have a role to play in that area. I want to pick up on Simo's point about learning together in community. Maybe it's somebody else's perspective, even if it's different from our own, that can inform us or help us understand something a bit better. So please don't go on this journey in isolation. Learn from others and let's take the posture of a learner. And then finally, that whole concept of loving our neighbor. What does it look like for us to follow and take seriously the greatest commandment from Jesus, to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves? We hope that this has been an informative time. I want to thank our special guests and experts for giving their insight and their time to help us learn together as a community. I hope that some of your questions have been answered. If they haven't, feel free to send us an email or comment and we'll do our best to respond to them in the weeks and months ahead. And we just pray a blessing on you, particularly at this time, particularly in this season, as we seek to beat this virus and move forward into everything that God has for us. God bless, and we look forward to seeing you soon.